So one thing that we covered uh, last time we were here is doing some good file organization on the computer. This means having folders that have names that are let us know what's inside of them, and then having files that we can remember where they are, so we can find them to continue working on them. So I have a folder on my desktop for the class for MMP 100, which is where I'm going to put all of the projects that I work on. And if I open this up into the Finder, which is this little guy, you'll see I have this self-portrait folder. I like to kind of change the way the Finder looks. So if you haven't done this, you might see a view that looks more like this. That's fine. However you prefer is fine. I tend to use this view so that I can see which folder is where, basically. So I'll usually skip over to here when I'm using the Finder. Another thing that may look different if you haven't set this up is down here I have the path that shows me where I am on the computer. If you want to see that, you can go to View and go to Show Path Bar. Mine says Hide because I've already shown it. And this lets me see that I'm in the self-portrait folder, in the MMP 100 folder, in the desktop, in my user, in the users folder, and here's the origin of the whole computer. So in my self-portrait folder, I have the two images which I downloaded from, I think, Wikimedia. I have this lizard and I have this pigeon. And then I have my PSD file, which is the file that I can edit to make my composition. And I'm making a self-portrait. It doesn't really actually have anything to do with me, which is fine. I chose a city landscape because I live in New York, and I found this pigeon photo that I liked, and I thought it'd be funny if there was a lizard in there. Your self-portrait is really very open-ended. It doesn't have to include you in it, although it can if you would like it to. It doesn't have to include anything specific other than things that you think would represent yourself. The only real rule for the self-portrait assignment for this part of it is that you have to composite two different images together, at least. You can add more to that if you want to. So I'm just going to double click on this PSD to open this up. And so far, I don't really have that much going on in my project. I moved my layers panel over here so I can more easily access it. Just to really quickly review that, with the Photoshop interface, there's all these different panels that do different things, and I can move them around to make it easier to access things that I want to use. So if I go up to Window and I go to Workspace, I actually saved this as Owen's cool layer workspace. But if I wanted to go back to the Essentials, I could go to Essentials, and it's not updating. Let's try that again. Maybe I have to say Reset Essentials. There we go. Okay, so I'll choose Essentials, then I have to say Reset Essentials. And if I want to go back to my cool layer workspace, I can click on there, and it'll go back. And if I change this arrangement somehow and I want to save a new version, I can go to Workspace and say New Workspace and save it here. So the reason I have this is because my layers panel is like the main thing that I'm going to be working with because I'm compositing images together. And so one of the things that Photoshop does is it separates different parts of our composition onto different layers so that we can play with them and turn them on and off and sort of edit them independently of each other. So I have this like pigeon. I didn't really change anything about this. I just kind of scaled it. And just to review real quick, to scale or modify an image or anything in Photoshop, I can hit Command T on the keyboard. I'm going to hit Command minus to zoom out a little bit. And so when I hit Command T, I get this transform tool where I can rotate, I can scale. I'm hitting Command Z to undo these as I'm doing them. And I can move it around on the canvas as well. So I'm going to undo that. And when I'm done with my transformations, I just hit Enter to save that. So I didn't change anything about this image. I just basically made it the background for my composition. So what I did change is this lizard. This lizard used to have a bunch of other information, and what I did is I added a mask to the lizard so that I would basically mask out all the background info. And the way I did that, let's do that real quick just to review. I'm gonna turn this one off for a second. I dragged my lizard in here, so I grabbed the lizard from the Finder. Oh, by the way, I think I talked about this, but what I'm doing right now to switch between the programs is I'm hitting Command Tab on the Mac, and that brings up a list of all your programs, so you can move in between them just by hitting Command and Tab again. But if you have two programs that you want to move in between quickly, I don't know why the text edit is open. I'm going to quit that. Oh, I had the computer login information. Let's get rid of that. Okay, so if I hit it quickly, I can really quickly jump back and forth between those two programs. You don't have to do it that way. It's just how I do it to move a little faster. Anyway, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to demonstrate just quickly dragging my lizard into my Photoshop composition. So I'm going to drag the lizard and drop it right there. And you can see that it has the free transform like boxes set up, so I can move it around, I can scale just like I did before, and when I have it where I want it, I can hit enter. So that's how I added another layer. I can move this layer around, so I can drag it down here, and now it's under the pigeon. So whatever you have on the top is what's going to be visible above other things. And then what I did to mask out the lizard is I chose this object selection tool, and I kind of like made a square around the lizard, and it's going to kind of try to choose this object, and that blue line or the blue fill shows where the lizard is, so I clicked on there. And then the part that is easy to forget is where the mask button is, because it's really small. It's down here. It's a little rectangle with a circle. When I hit mask, it removes everything except for the shape in my selection. And I can always delete this mask. Whoops. So if I control click, I can just disable or delete. And when I say control click, I mean I hold control on the keyboard and then I click here. You see this little menu icon comes up. That's like a context menu. So it's for getting specific options for this part of my layer. So now my layer consists of this image and the mask itself. And if I double click on the mask, I can edit the mask. We kind of went over this pretty quickly. I have this like view where I can remove or add to the mask by painting like I would a drawing. So that's a quick review. I'm just gonna delete this and we'll look at a few new things for today. So I'm gonna say delete this and yes. And so that's how I can get one image into another image relatively cleanly. I went into a lot more detail in the previous class, so if you want to review that, go watch that video on YouTube. What I'm going to talk about today is how do I make it look more realistic? Whoops. So I'm going to focus on the lizard. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm going to hit Command plus. Also, if I want to zoom out to full, I just hit Command 0. That fits the image. And if I hit Command 1, that's the true resolution of the image. So that's how it would look if I published it on a website or something. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to focus on this lizard, because one of the things that makes this lizard appear, even though we've cut out the background, the lizard doesn't really look like it's part of this scene. And there's a couple of reasons for that, having to do with basically the color and lighting. And so what I want to try to do, and I'm not going to be able to do this perfectly because I'm going to go through pretty quickly for the demo's purposes, but what I want to try to do is match the colors in the lizard to the colors I see in the background image. I'm also going to stylize it. So first I'm going to try to make it look real, but then I'm going to stylize it so that the whole thing doesn't really look real, and that's going to kind of hide the differences in the colors a little bit. So I'm holding space on the keyboard to move around, and I'm just going to zoom in on the lizard a little bit, and I'm going to look at some different options for how I can change the way that this lizard looks. There's a bunch of different things I can do in Photoshop. I'm going to go over a few of those quickly and talk about what they do. So one thing I'm going to do before I start with that is I'm actually going to duplicate this layer. So I'm going to click on this menu up here and click duplicate layer and hit OK. And then I'll turn this one off. I could even like drag it down here or something like that. I want to leave this original thing down here so that if I make a change that destroys the original copy and then I don't like it, at some point, I can always just like really quickly go back to what I had before. I do this a lot when I'm working. You don't have to, but I find it to be useful. Okay, so there are some really basic things that we can do with this layer to change the way that it blends in with the rest of the scene. And those options are right here in my layers panel. This dropdown is called the blending mode of this layer. And that does a bunch of different things, but they're kind of coarse. They're not very refined. So they're not going to be that useful, but we'll take a look at what they do. There's also a more simple one called opacity. This is just whether or not the image is transparent. So if I wanted to make like a ghost lizard, I could kind of make the transparency a lot lower, and that would be effective for doing that. I don't really want to make a ghost lizard, so I'm just going to leave the opacity at 100. With my blending modes, I can do some cool stuff, like I can lighten or screen or dodge. All these different things change the way that those colors mix with the colors behind it. Some of these are pretty cool effects. Again, maybe useful for ghost lizards or a more stylized version of this, but they're not really effective for what I'm trying to do here. So I'm not going to use these a lot, but they are there, and they are really useful if you're trying to do something kind of like cool or stylized in Photoshop. And really what that's doing is it's just changing the way that, remember we talked about the individual pixels of color? If we zoom in really far, we can see the image is just comprised of this huge grid of different colors. And what the blending mode does, normal just means it's just whatever color is in that image. But when we use a different blending mode, for example, let's use, where is it? Subtract. Subtract is going to subtract the color from whatever color is beneath it. So it's actually doing an operation on the numbers that make up that color. Remember the red, green, and blue values. So this is really pretty basic, and it's not that useful. There are much more sophisticated ways of changing the way that this light or color works with this particular part of our composition. I want to move my lizard a little bit. I'm going to stick his head over the side of this thing. So I'm just using the move tool up here. Just want to get him up there. I think that looks a little cooler. Anyway, so let's look at a couple more sophisticated things. And one thing that I'm going to want to do, well, actually, let's just look at it first. So what I can do is I can go to Image and then go to Adjustments. And this is where we're going to find more sophisticated ways of playing with the lighting. So one thing that is really useful but kind of hard to use is levels. But I'm going to just show this as an example of kind of how this works. So this levels thing will basically show us how much of each color is in that layer. And so you can see, I can see all the colors together, or I can see just the red, just the green, and just the blue. And it gives us a little graph of how much color is there. So for example, if we take the red and we take the high end out of the red, you see we get a much more red looking image. Whereas if we take the low end out of the red, we are removing the red. So we're changing how much of those different color values we're getting. If I take it all together, I can just kind of change the general brightness. So I can make it more or less dark. And I actually use levels a lot when I'm working on my own because you have a lot of very specific control over things and you can do things very quickly. But it's a little confusing if you've never used it before. There are other adjustments that are a little bit more straightforward. So for example, this hue and saturation is pretty useful, where you can actually change the entire hue of the image. You probably don't want to do that, but what's more useful, let's get that back. What's more useful is the saturation and the lightness. Saturation is how much color there is. So if I turn the saturation down, notice my lizard starts to look less bright. And that actually is really useful. I'm just changing the general amount of color, and he looks a little bit more natural now, right? He looks a little bit more like he belongs in this scene. So that's actually a pretty good adjustment that I might leave here. The lightness is how dark or light it is. If I turn this all the way down, it's going to be black. If I turn it all the way up, it's going to be white. I don't think I want to play with the lightness too much here, but oh whoops, I keep hitting enter when I shouldn't. So I can change these things. Once you add an adjustment, you'll see your layer gets this little circle and there's a little drop down, and you can see the filters here. I accidentally added this first one, so I'm just going to delete that. Or no, I guess I accidentally added this one. There we go. If I want to change this, I can click on the little icon here, or I guess I double click, or no, I double click here. Okay, so I double click on the text here, and that'll bring this back up. I can also turn this on and off to see, does that really look better, and sort of compare and contrast. So if I want to make it a little lighter, I can do that. If I want to make it a little darker, I think a little bit darker is useful here. So I can hit OK. So hue and saturation is one way of talking about color. It's how much color it is, and then whether it's darker or lighter. Let's look at a couple more adjustment layers. You can see there's a lot of them. We don't have time to go over all of them, but we can cover a few. So another one that could be useful is exposure. This has to do with when you're using a camera, how much light is let into the camera lens. So the more light you let in, the more light you're going to get in your photo. And so you can see, let's turn off the hue saturation for a second. And let's go back to exposure. If I turn the exposure up, I'm going to get this blown out, brighter image. If I turn it down, I'm going to get a darker image. This I don't think is going to be super useful because I'm not really a photographer and I don't have as good of a command of these terms as I do of like just the general color effects. But I can play around with this. I can do some different things and see if it looks good. But ultimately, I don't think I want to use this, so I'm going to hit cancel. Let's look at one more. Let's look at color balance. Okay. So this gives me some more controls over the color levels. I can make it more red or more blue. I can make it more blue versus more yellow. I can make it more magenta or green. I can then target the different types of colors like shadows, midtones, highlights. I don't really think this is going to be that useful. I might make it a little more blue, I think, because I do think the lighting in the background image is pretty blue. So if I make this a little bit more blue, I think it looks a little bit better. I'm just going to make it a little bit more blue. And then if I turn that saturate, no, that's too much. So let's turn that off. That wasn't really that useful. Anyway, we did a little bit of an adjustment there. And it actually looks a lot, it looks more natural, right? It blends in with the background. So I'm changing the foreground thing, but I can also change the background. And one thing I can do to make it easier is just to flatten out the colors a little bit. So if I go to image and go to adjustments, I would probably use just hue and saturation again here. And I would just desaturate it a little bit. This will make it easier. Well, actually, I've already kind of matched it, so I don't really. But if I desaturate it a little bit, that just means there's less color information, so it's a little bit easier to add. But anyway, there's a lot of different ways to do this stuff. I would really recommend just like playing around with all these different filters. You don't have to go for realism, so don't worry if it doesn't look perfect. Mainly the goal of this assignment is just to play around with stuff and see if we can make something look interesting. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how to change the color and lighting. Now what I want to do is talk about if I want to just do something really stylized, if I want to just make something that doesn't look at all like the original photography. How do I apply a filter or adjustment to everything in the scene? So if I want to do this, what I can do, I can use this adjustment area and I can just like click on one of these and it'll make me an adjustment layer. I can also say like add adjustment, or no, maybe I have to say new adjustment layer. So I can make a new adjustment layer and then choose an adjustment I want to do. So some of these are for just changing the colors, but some of them are like more advanced. There's filters, there's like different things we can do. I'm going to do something called a gradient map. This is a really easy way to get like a cool stylized look on something. So when I go to new adjustment layer and I choose an adjustment, I'm going to go to gradient map. this is gonna adjust everything that's under it. So if I put my lizard above this, see the lizard still has color. But if I grab the lizard and put it below here, now we're applying this gradient map. Right now it's just black and white, but we're gonna change that in a second. So an adjustment layer will apply to everything that's below it. So that way I can apply my effects to the entire composition with one layer. So for my gradient map, the reason I like this, you'll see in a second, basically I'm gonna edit this gradient. So once I set the gradient map, I can double click on this gradient map editor. And basically I can just replace all the colors with new colors. And they have some good presets. So like if I like one of these presets, if I want to do some like kind of like weird like pastel color palette, let's choose one like that. See how it just replaces all the colors in the image with these two colors, but it matches the relative brightness. And then I can add more colors in here. I want something with a little more. Here we go. Well, actually, that's probably too many. Let's go with something like here. 3 colors is probably good. Okay. And then I can play with these colors. So I can drag these around. Actually, I want to choose something a little more saturated because it's kind of hard to see what's happening. Let's go with this one. Okay, that'll be easier to see what's happening. Okay, so I have 4 colors. So if I move this one closer to here, then I kind of get less blues and more purples, but I also get these kind of nice hard edges in certain areas. I can do the same thing over here. So I can just get some like very like specific highlights. Like you can see like the lizard, the only real part of the image that's getting that is these like lizard things, so that's kind of fun. And then I can also adjust this, which changes the amount of color going towards each one of these. And then I can change these colors as well. Like if I think this blue is too dark, I can make it lighter, or I can make it even darker. Actually, probably darker is better. And so I can really create this kind of like interesting stylized look with this layer, and it applies to everything that goes below it. And I can do this a bunch of times. Like another adjustment that might be fun, let's see, like threshold could be kind of fun. Actually, I'm gonna delete this. Let's do posterize. Okay, so posterize basically takes out those colors and it flattens them. And the number of levels is how many colors there are. So if I go all the way to 255, it basically looks the same. But as I take out certain colors, you see that the blocks of color, like if there's just 2 colors, we just get these two different colors. And if we add a few, like I think like 6 will be good. Maybe even less. I think actually 4 is pretty good. So we get this like posterized effect. So it's kind of an interesting new look. And then now we really can't tell the difference between the lizard and the pigeon at all. It looks like they belong, they're both just originally in here. And then I can turn these on and off using my eyeballs a bit. And so I can get some different types of effects that way. So obviously there's a lot more to cover when it comes to this stuff. I don't have time to go over every single effect and every single adjustment, but I hope that's enough for you guys to get started kind of playing around with this stuff and coming up with something interesting. I'm going to stop there so you guys have a good amount of time to work now, and I'm going to do a couple shorter little demos later in class after the break. Those 2 demos, I'm going to go over how to export an image from Photoshop. We don't really know how to do this, need to know how to do this today, but I'm just going to go over it so that we can cover other stuff later. And then we're going to do a quick intro to Illustrator as well. But I do want to give you guys enough time to sort of play around and get started and ask me questions to get started on your composition. And so we'll do that for the next hour. We'll have our break from 2:40 to 3, and then at 3, we'll do a couple more short demos. So I'm going to stop the recording here, and then if you guys have any questions, I'll go over them.